Autumn has officially begun, and what better way to celebrate the transition than with an apple harvest? Today we're going to be talking about crabapples, and I'm going to show you a really cool way on how you can utilize these little fruits. Crabapple trees love lots of sun, and they're commonly found growing along roadsides, in fields, woodlands, and meadows. There are many varieties of crabapples, and their identifying features are a little bit different depending on which specific variety that you have. In the spring, the trees produce flowers with 5 petals, and the colors vary from white, pink to red. They have oval-shaped leaves with serrated edges. This means that the edges of the leaves look like they're sawtoothed in appearance. These trees eventually produce small, firm fruits known as crabapples. These crabapples come in a variety of colors like green, yellow, orange, and red. Crabapple fruits are also incredibly tart. And depending on the variety, the flesh of these crabapples can be white, red, a yellowish color, or pink. The fruits also produce multiple little seeds that look just like the seeds you would find in a cultivated apple. Some of these apple varieties are very easy to identify because they look just like the miniature versions of cultivated apples. But then you get some crabapple varieties that look like little berries, and those ones can be a lot more tricky to identify. So all that being said, you really want to make sure that you ID these properly because you don't want to accidentally consume a toxic berry thinking that it's a tiny little crabapple. Although apples seem like they'd be something that's very easy to identify, they are very tricky just because there are so many varieties out there. As a visual example, on my walk here, I was able to collect a few different varieties, and you can see that they all look very different from each other. There are too many different varieties of crabapples to count, so how do you know which specific variety of crabapple you're consuming? Here's the tricky part. Because of a process called cross-pollination, it's almost impossible to know. Cross-pollination happens when a pollinator, such as a bee or a butterfly, transfers pollen from one variety of plant to another variety of plant of the same species. As an example, let's use common cultivated apple varieties that people are very familiar with. Let's say we have a Red Delicious apple tree in close proximity to a Honeycrisp apple tree. Our little bee friend starts at the Red Delicious apple tree, collects some pollen, flies over to the Honeycrisp apple tree, and pollinates its flowers. When the Honeycrisp apple tree produces fruit, it's still going to produce only Honeycrisp apples. No matter what, that Honeycrisp apple tree will always produce fruit that's genetically linked to the tree it's growing off of. So nothing within that tree will change. However, the fruits that grew due to cross-pollination will contain seeds that are a hybrid mix from the trees it was cross-pollinated with. And if those seeds manage to germinate, they're going to create an entire new variety of apple. So when you see a whole bunch of crabapple trees growing in close proximity to each other and they all look a little bit different, chances are there might have been some cross-pollination happening there. Unless you can break down the apple to figure out its genetics in some sort of laboratory setting, you're likely not going to know what variety of apple you truly have. When it comes to toxic lookalikes, the only plant that you have to be genuinely concerned about is called the manchineel. The good news is that this plant is very geographically restricted, and it only grows in the Caribbean or in Florida. As you know, at the end of my videos, I always like to show you something that I've created with my finds. You might notice in the recipe coming up that my apples seem a little bit larger than crabapples. So full disclosure, I'm not using crabapples in that recipe. The only reason why I'm not is because I was fortunate enough to come across some rogue apple trees. You might be wondering what a rogue apple tree is. A rogue apple tree is a tree that came from cultivated origin, but it wasn't grown on purpose. Essentially, someone was probably munching on an apple, and when they were finished, they just threw their core off into the woods. The seeds within the apple core eventually germinated and grew into an apple tree that did produce fruit. So although they aren't true wild apples, I still sort of consider them to be wild apples because I did forage them, I found them on my own, nobody pointed out where they were, they grew on their own under natural conditions, nobody was tending to the trees. In my mind, that's a wild tree. And the reason why I'm using them rather than the crabapples is because they're just a little bit bigger and a little bit easier to work with. But in the recipe I'm about to show you, it doesn't actually matter what variety of apple that you have. Crabapples work perfectly fine in this case. If you aren't sure if you have a rogue cultivated apple or a crabapple, all you have to do is look at the size. Crabapples will typically be 2 inches in diameter or smaller, whereas cultivated apples will typically be larger than 2 inches in diameter. Today we're going to be making 2 different types of wild vinegars, apple cider vinegar and wild plum vinegar. A few months ago I foraged wild plums to make jam, and I decided to make vinegar out of the scraps. If you're interested in watching my video on how to ID wild plums, I linked the video in the description below. Vinegar making is surprisingly a very simple process. It's a great way to use up your fruit scraps to make an additional product. I began by placing my fruit scraps in a jar. I then add 2 tablespoons of live apple cider vinegar and just under a cup of sugar. I filled the jar with some water and I gave everything a good mix to make sure that the sugar was dissolved. There's no set ratio for the amount of sugar that you need to use, and it's completely dependent on your personal preferences. If you'd like your vinegar to be a little bit sweeter, you add more sugar. If you want your vinegar to be more tart, you just add less. In order to keep my apple scraps submerged in the mixture, I placed a smaller measuring cup inside the mouth of my jar, and then I covered it all up with a piece of cheesecloth which I secured with a rubber band. Using cheesecloth is extremely important because the mixture requires exposure to air. The fermentation required to make vinegar cannot occur without oxygen. Now I'm going to repeat everything we just did, but this time with the wild plum scraps. Adding live vinegar to your mixture is completely optional. The only reason why I do this is because it helps speed up the process to make the mixture become vinegar quicker, and it also helps prevent the fruit scraps from getting moldy. If you choose not to add a live vinegar to your mixture, it's just going to take your mixture a lot longer to become vinegar. The wild plum scraps weren't floating like the apple bits, so there was no need for me to weigh them down with anything. The jars stay on the counter at room temperature, and you want to make sure that you're stirring your mixtures every other day for about 2 weeks. This is what the mixtures look like after about a week. The bubbles are a really good sign, and that indicates to me that fermentation has been happening. In case it's not clear in the video, the jar with the wild plum mixture is not being secured by a solid lid, but it's actually only being secured by a mason jar ring. Stirring the mixtures is the only maintenance they require. After about 2 weeks, we're going to strain out our mixtures into clean jars and place back on the counter at room temperature for another month. Don't forget to replace the cheesecloth with a fresh one, and remember not to seal your jar because oxygen is still needed during this process. Now that all the fruit scraps have been strained out of the mixtures, you no longer have to worry about stirring your mixtures. You can also smell and taste your mixture along the way to see if you like where it's at. Making vinegar is a 2-step process. The first step is alcohol fermentation. This is where yeast consumes sugars within a liquid and converts it into alcohol. The bubbles that you see present in the jar are the result of alcohol fermentation. The second part in the process is called acetic acid fermentation. This occurs after alcohol fermentation is complete and acetic acid bacteria take over. This step in the fermentation process is where oxygen is absolutely crucial, as this fermentation cannot occur without oxygen. Acetic acid is the main component of vinegar, and this is where your mixture transforms into a vinegar solution. It's now been about 6 weeks since I began this process, and I really like where my vinegar's at. The last thing I'm going to do is stop the fermentation process, and I'm also going to add some additional sweetness. The additional sweetness is completely optional depending on your taste preferences. I use my vinegars for salad dressings, and I prefer them to be on the sweet side. To end the fermentation process, you're just going to heat up your vinegar until you see steam coming off of the liquid. You don't need to bring it to a boil, it just has to be hot enough where you see the steam. If I add the sugar without ending the fermentation process, the mixture is just going to continue to eat up that sugar. It's just going to continue to ferment, which will make for an even stronger tasting vinegar. Stir until all the additional sugar is mixed into your vinegar, then remove from the heat and bottle it up. These vinegars taste so great, they're so simple to make, and they make excellent gifts for people over the holidays. Let me know in the comments if you've ever made fruit scrap vinegar before, which fruits you've used, and which ones are your favorite.